They buried her. While I was still unconscious, I woke up to fluorescent lights. The TV above me played the morning news on low volume. Some local election. Lexington's mayoral race. But I didn't care. What caught my eye was the folded pamphlet on the tray beside my bed. In loving memory, Eloise McAllister. Date 3 days ago. Service held at Rosehill Chapel. I stared at it like it was fake, like some twisted joke the nurses left behind. I hit the call button. Twice. Then I pulled my IV out. Pain bloomed down my back, but I swung my legs over. That's when I saw the second envelope. Brown, sealed. My name scrawled in pen. But it wasn't her handwriting. It was Mark's. Inside, a sticky note. What couldn't reach you in time? Mom didn't want to wait. Please don't make this harder than it already is. No signature. Just the sting. Just the silence. I called him. Straight to voicemail. Again. And again. I tried Sandy, Mom's favorite nurse at the hospice. Disconnected. I closed my eyes. Saw the last moment I had with her. She was half asleep, but still held my hand. She whispered, "Promise me you'll take the house. And the garden. You earned it." Her voice was thin, but clear. I promised. Now, not only was she gone, but they buried her while I was under anesthesia. They didn't even let me say goodbye. And the worst part, they didn't tell me because they wanted me gone. They'd waited years for this, and I'd walked right into it. I sat there in that sterile room, gown half open, stitches still raw, but the deeper wound wasn't physical. It was knowing I stayed, and still wasn't counted. She didn't want to see you again, Mark would later say. But I knew better. I had her voice, and they didn't know that yet. If your family buried your mother without telling you, would you forgive? Or fight for the truth? Share below. 1 for forgive, 2 for justice. The army taught me how to stop bleeding, set bones, carry men twice my size out of gunfire. But nothing trains you for watching your mother forget your name. 1 syllable at a time. When I came home from Afghanistan, I thought I'd stay for 6 weeks. Help her recover after that first fall. 6 weeks turned into 6 years. Mark called maybe once a month. Flew in for Thanksgiving, when it was convenient. Mom always lit up when he arrived. "Your brother's here," she'd say, fixing her lipstick with trembling hands. She never noticed he left early. Always early. The old house creaked like it was tired, too. Radiators hissed in winter. Kitchen window stuck on humid days. But it held us. That little white bungalow on Harlan Street. I installed grab bars in the bathroom. Labeled pill boxes. Learned to cook her favorite squash soup without too much salt. Sat through the same stories over and over. Did I tell you about the day your father proposed? Yes, Mom. Every Sunday. I didn't date. Didn't travel. Didn't take the job offer in Atlanta. Didn't ask for anything. Sometimes, I caught myself watching the mailman just to see another face. Some days, I forgot how to speak to anyone who wasn't struggling to breathe. But I stayed. Because that's what daughters do. Especially daughters who know what it means to lose someone on a stretcher. One night, around 2 a.m., she reached for my hand. Fingers cold. She whispered, "You're the one who stayed. That's how I know it's all yours." Then she fell asleep. Didn't even hear me whisper back. "I know, Mom. I know." But when I asked the hospice nurse for a copy of her will, she said, "It's already been filed. Your brother dropped it off last week." The hospice nurse looked uneasy. She shifted her clipboard, then leaned in. "He said your mother updated everything before she passed. That she wanted things simplified." Simplified. What a polite way to erase someone. The law office sat in a glass building downtown. Mark had arranged everything, apparently. Didn't even ask if I wanted to come. When I stepped in, the receptionist looked surprised. "Oh, we weren't expecting you today." That made two of us. They brought out a folder. Manila, thick, initials EM, inside a copy of a new will. Signed, notarized. 2 weeks before she passed. Her signature looked shaky, like her hands had forgotten how to hold pens. But it was hers. Or close enough. I flipped through the pages. No mention of me. No property transfer, no joint account. No trust. The house, the bank account, the safety deposit box. All to Mark, the same man who visited twice a year and complained that the house smelled old. I looked up. The lawyer avoided my eyes. She was of sound mind when she signed. He said flatly. We had medical confirmation. I wanted to scream. Instead, I asked one question. Who brought her here that day? He blinked. Flipped a calendar. Your brother. Of course. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the kitchen barefoot. Opened the cabinet above the stove, where she hid cookies from me as a kid. Still empty, like I knew it would be. Then I saw it. Her blue cardigan still hanging on the chair. I slipped my hand in the pocket. A tissue. 1 mint. And a slip of folded paper. In her handwriting. Sandy Cloud password Eloise 1974. For Diane. My hand started shaking. Because if Sandy had saved something, then maybe. Mom never changed her will at all. I hadn't seen Sandy since the night Mom slipped into that final sleep. She held the morphine line steady, whispered. You can rest now, Mom, like she was talking to a soldier. They'd served together once. Desert Trauma Unit, 2008. Sandy patched wounds. I held pressure on arteries. No one else could have gotten Mom to sleep like that. I texted her. The number was still saved as Sandy Vay Shift, no response. So I tried email. Nothing. Then I called the hospice. She's no longer with us, they said. Left a few weeks ago. Didn't leave forwarding. Of course not. But the slip of paper, the password. It wasn't random. I booted up Mom's old laptop, still dusty, still slow. Typed in Eloise 1974. Nothing. Then I remembered. Sandy had once said, I keep backups. You never know when family gets greedy. The next day, I drove to the bank. Same teller, same smell. Lemon disinfectant and aging files. I slid my ID across. I'm here about the joint account with Eloise McAllister. She frowned. Typed something. It was converted to sole ownership under Mark McAllister. 2 days before your mother passed. She wasn't mobile then. 8 was notarized. I stepped outside, stomach twisting. The sun was too bright. The wind too warm. And for the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel like her daughter. I sat in the car, turned off the radio, let the silence ring. Then I opened my email. One new message. Subject T. Found something. From Sandy. I backed up one voicemail. She made me promise. If you ever needed proof. Audio attached. I pressed play. Her voice, raspy, tired, but clear. If Diane's not there, it's not her fault. She stayed. She earned it all. I covered my mouth. Tears burned, and something in me shifted. THEVOICTHYDDND. I played the voicemail 5 times. Not because I didn't believe it, but because hearing her voice again broke something and mended something at the same time. The tone carried wariness, but no doubt. That slight Kentucky drawl softened by morphine. Maybe, but still hers. Still Mom. She paused before saying my name. She always did that, like the word, Dion. Held more weight than her tongue could carry. Like it meant something deeper than just a name. She had recorded it days before her body gave out. But not her mind. Not her loyalty. And she didn't give it to Mark. Didn't entrust it to the lawyer. She gave it to Sandy. To me. The audio file sat in my inbox, humming like a living thing. I saved it 3 times. Flash drive number 1 in the ceramic tin labeled T. In my kitchen. Flash drive 2, tucked between winter socks I hadn't worn since 2020. The third, buried beneath the flat garden stone with the chipped corner, same one I used to hide pennies under as a kid. Was that paranoid? Maybe. But trust had been a luxury lately. One I couldn't afford. That night, I pulled out the will we drafted years ago. Thick, cream-colored paper, stapled neatly. Signed in black ink. Me, Mom, and old Mr. Tom from next door. I could still see him standing in our kitchen, a jug of sweet tea in hand, joking about being a legal witness. The signature was strong then. Her L's didn't drift, her E's didn't shake. She even dotted her I with care. Like she was writing a love letter to the life she was about to leave behind. That was the version I believed, not the one Mark filed. His was dated 2 weeks before she passed. I flipped it open again, hands cold. Her name, same ink, but not the same pressure. The curve of her letters wobbled. A loop was missing. The tail of the R in McAllister barely existed. They claimed she was of sound mind. But paper didn't lie, and neither did hesitation. The next morning, I called the notary. Harold Kramer. The name was printed on the last page of Mark's version. I found a landline number listed under a retired county clerk registry. He answered on the third ring. Voice rough with age but polite. Yes, Mayim, I remember your mother. Lovely woman. Frail, but sharp eyes. Real sharp. I asked if she had seemed clear that day. I asked if she spoke much. He paused. She seemed like she wanted to say something. Didn't, though. But you could tell. She was nervous. Then he added, almost offhand. Your brother drove her. Stayed in the car. Never came in. Never came in. He brought her but didn't step inside. I thanked Harold, hung up, and sat still for a long time. The heater kicked in. Somewhere in the vent, a piece of metal popped. Like a ticking clock I couldn't stop. I dug out the envelope Mark left on my hospital tray. The one I'd ignored in the haze of pain meds and grief. It still smelled faintly like antiseptic. Inside one page. No letterhead. Just a note. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Harder for who, Mark? For you. Because I might ask questions. Or for me. Because you already had your answer. I set it down beside my mug. The coffee had gone cold. The house hadn't changed much. Still the same yellow curtains. Still the crocheted blanket Mom made back in '98. But the pictures, that's what hit me hardest. Photos were missing. The hallway used to be filled. Me in uniform beside Mom in the garden, the three of us at Dad's memorial, even the one where Mark had red eye and begged me not to frame it. Gone, replaced by clean frames. Mark and Mom. Mark at the Derby. Mark holding flowers beside her hospital bed. I was nowhere. It was like I had been gently erased. Not violently. Not loudly. But thoroughly. The next morning, I drove to First Lexington Bank. The teller was young, polite. She wore too much perfume and kept her nails perfect. I gave her my ID. Explained I was looking into a joint account with my mother. Her face changed when she pulled it up. That account was converted to sole ownership under Mr. Mark McAllister. She said. When? I asked. 2 days before she passed. She couldn't get out of bed that week. I said. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. I nodded, though it meant nothing. Gathered my things. Left without looking back. That night I went outside. The garden was messy. Unruly. Weeds pushed between the old slate stones. The bench under the maple tree still stood, faded, but strong. I sat, held the flash drive in my palm. Pressed play, and there she was. If Diane's not there, it's not her fault. She stayed. She earned it all. My eyes burned. But I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered back. I'm still here, Mama. I stayed. I didn't sleep that night. I walked the hallway barefoot, just like I used to when I was on night shifts in Kandahar, checking for pulse lights on IV drips. Except here, there were no patients. Only echoes of my own footsteps and the low creak of a tired old house. I touched the picture frame on the mantel. It was still warm from the afternoon sun. Empty now, its back flap half open, the photo removed. I used to keep a snapshot of me and Mom at my army graduation there. She wore her church hat, cried when they handed me the certificate. She told everyone, "She's stronger than I'll ever be." I guess Mark didn't think that was worth remembering. My fingers traced the grooves in the wood. Dad carved this mantel after their first wedding anniversary. He built things to last. But no one teaches you how to make memories tamper-proof. By the sink, a coffee mug still sat from the morning. I rushed to the ER. Lipstick print faded. Her favorite green one that read, "I raised warriors." I exhaled slowly. Like maybe the air still carried her breath. I sat at the kitchen table. Light off, only the fridge humming. My laptop glowed softly. The message I'd sent was still on the screen. I reread it 3 times, not for typos, but to remind myself I really did it. I sent it. I took the first step. Without yelling. Without threats. Without trying to prove anything. Just the truth. That's what Mom gave me. Not just her words, but her trust. And when someone leaves you that kind of voice, you don't waste it. You protect it. Like a medal. Like a flag folded after a burial. Before I went to sleep, I opened Mom's closet. Everything still hung where she left it. Cardigans by color. Scarves tucked in a bin she labeled spring. The smell. Lavender sachets. A faint hint of vapor rub. Hit me like a memory too real to hold. I slid my fingers across the fabric. Stopped at the navy blouse she wore every Sunday. Still had a pin on it. Her old nurse badge. E. McAllister, RN. She never threw that badge away. Even when her hands trembled too much to work, she said, "Once a nurse. Always a nurse. You never stop caring." I held the fabric to my chest, and I let go, just for a second. Not the resolve, not the fight. Just the ache I'd carried for weeks. This wasn't about a house. Or money. Or who got what when the dirt settled. It was about the quiet promise between a mother and a daughter. That what you give, gets remembered. And if the world tried to rewrite that, I'd write it back, not with rage, not with fire, but with her voice. And the steady, stubborn, unshakable truth, I stayed, and that mattered. This time, I had her voice, and it was louder than anything they'd written down. YULLFT. ANDOTHRLIES. The call came at 8:17 a.m. I hadn't had coffee. Hadn't brushed my hair. I was still in the sweatshirt Mom gave me last Christmas. Gray with a faded hummingbird on the front. The phone buzzed once, twice. I didn't want to answer, but I did. "Hello," I said, voice cracked. "Mark. We need to talk." No apology, no good morning. Just an order disguised as a courtesy. "I don't owe you a conversation," I said. Maybe not. But Mom would have wanted it. That name in his mouth made my skin crawl. I agreed to meet him at the house. Not because I wanted to, but because some wars you don't choose. When I pulled into the driveway, he was already there, sitting on the porch swing like he owned the air. Same blazer from the funeral photos. Same self-important smirk. But when he stood, he looked older. Maybe guilt adds years. Or maybe he just finally saw me as something that didn't bend. I didn't speak first. He did. I didn't know they'd file it so fast. I thought you were still recovering. Recovering. From the surgery, or from being erased. I was still intubated, I said. He looked down, hands in his pockets. It's not like I planned this. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I stepped onto the porch. Closer than I wanted. Close enough to see the shadows in his eyes. "You changed the locks," I said. It was for security. The house was unoccupied. You replaced the photos. That made him freeze. Mom didn't like those old pictures. She didn't like them, or you didn't. He didn't answer. I reached into my coat, pulled out a flash drive, held it up. This is Mom. 2 weeks before she died. Her voice. You're bluffing. I handed it to him. Play it. His fingers curled but didn't move. Diane, this isn't necessary. We're family. That word hit harder than I expected. Family. I remembered the last time I heard it in a tent half a world away. Flashback Kandahar, 2008. Dust choked the sky like war was trying to erase the sun. 2 soldiers dragged in. Both bleeding, both barely conscious. One had shrapnel in the neck. The other. Burns across half his body. I had 3 minutes and 1 unit of O negative. No time to hesitate. I picked the burn victim, because he still had a pulse. The other one died. The lieutenant said I made the right call. But the mother of the one who didn't make it sent me a letter. She wrote, "You left him. You had a choice, and you left him." I read it once, then carried it folded in my boot for 2 years. Like a punishment, like a penance. Now, my own brother sat in front of me saying the same thing. You weren't there. Not at the signing. Not at the funeral. Not in time, like absence made me unworthy. Back on the porch, the wind picked up. Chimes Mom hung on the awning clinked softly. She loved those, said they reminded her to breathe. You think because I wasn't at her funeral, I didn't earn her trust, I said. I think she was tired, and you weren't around. My throat tightened. I was in surgery. Because I'd spent 6 years lifting her out of bed. Mark sighed. This isn't about guilt. It's about closure. I stepped forward. No, Mark. This is about legacy. And yours was built on silence. He looked away. I left him there with the flash drive in his palm. Didn't wait for him to play it. Didn't need to. Mom's voice was already louder than anything he could say. I sat in my car for a long time after. Didn't drive. Didn't cry. Just listened. The chimes still played behind me, and Mom's voice echoed in my head like a prayer said too late. You stayed. You earned it all. Not flashy words, not legalese, but a truth so clear it didn't need a signature. That night, I found her letter, tucked inside a manila folder labeled, "For Diane, open after." The handwriting was softer than I remembered. She must have written it while her hands still worked well. I sat on the floor and read it by the light of the hallway. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Or you think I left without answers. I didn't. You were always the one who showed up. Even when I didn't deserve it, even when I made it hard, I didn't give you everything in words because I thought you already knew. But maybe I should have said it out loud. I trust you. And if you need proof, look for Sandy. She has what matters. I held the letter to my chest. It didn't fix everything, but it stitched something back together. The next morning I printed the audio file. Not just saved it. Printed the metadata. Date. Time. Device ID. I walked it into the lawyer's office. Didn't call ahead. Didn't ask permission. The receptionist blinked. I said, "I'm here to submit an amendment to my mother's probate record." She nodded. Reached for a folder. Name. Diane McAllister, daughter of Eloise. My voice didn't shake, not this time. It rained lightly as I walked to my car. Like something was softening. Like maybe the ground itself was listening. I didn't feel triumph. Just steadiness. The kind you only find after holding silence for too long. That night I opened one of Mom's old journals. She used to write in cheap spiral notebooks. Lists, recipes, thoughts about birds. But this one had something else. An entry from years ago, the corner folded. Mark sends flowers. Diane brings groceries. I think I know who loves me more, but I don't say it. I want them to figure it out for themselves. I don't want to choose. But life makes you choose, doesn't it? She never told me she wrote that. She never told him either. I ran my fingers over the page like it could somehow rewind time. I poured myself tea. Black, 2 sugars. Just like she used to make it. Sat by the window, watching the wind tease the old garden gate. No fireworks, no courtroom drama, just truth. And that was enough. I hovered over Mark's number. Thought about calling. But I didn't. Some endings don't need noise. They need clarity. And stillness. Before bed, I lit the old lavender candle she kept by the sink. It burned unevenly now, wax pooled like a crater. Used too often in those last few months when sleep never came easy. The smell took me back to quiet evenings. Wheelchair by the window, bird feeder swaying. Her voice asking, "Do you think the roses will come back next spring?" I never answered then. Just nodded. Now, in the stillness, I whispered, "They're still here, Mom. Just waiting." And maybe I was too. Not for revenge. Not for him. But for the strength to carry the truth forward. Not just for her. But for the part of me they tried to erase. And couldn't. The papar the tiri tio boary. It started with a name I almost forgot. Harold Kramer. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I called about Mom's signature. But something kept gnawing at me. His pause. The way his voice caught when I asked if she knew what she was signing. So I drove. 2 towns over, past horse farms and shuttered gas stations, until I reached his house. A 1-story brick ranch with wind chimes and a faded American flag. He opened the door before I knocked. "I figured you'd come." Inside, his wife poured coffee. Harold motioned to the table. He didn't waste time. "There's something I didn't say on the phone." Didn't know if I should. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, a notarized document. Mom's signature, my name, dated 3 weeks before she passed. Not 2. Not the version Mark filed. A different one. Same wishes as the older will, house, accounts, garden. To me. But this one had something else. A note handwritten at the bottoms. "Please ensure a copy is delivered to Legal Solutions LLP. EM." I looked up. "Did you send it?" He nodded slowly. "Certified mail." I tracked it. They signed for it. I stared at the page. Something ice cold settled in my spine. They received it. The lawyers had it. But they never mentioned it. And I knew why. "Mark." My stomach turned. "Do you have the receipt?" I asked. He walked into the other room, came back with a small white envelope. Inside USPS confirmation. Signed for by a paralegal I remembered, Erica. I knew her. Nice. Soft-spoken. She used to call Mom, Miss Ellie. I folded the document carefully, slid it into my bag. Harold looked tired. "Your mother knew what she was doing, Diane. She asked me twice to review it with her. She told me you were the one who stayed." Those words kept returning. "You stayed." I drove straight to the law office. Didn't call. Didn't warn. The receptionist blinked when she saw me. "I need to speak to Erica," I said. She hesitated. "She's not in today." Of course she wasn't. I pulled out the envelope. Slid it across the desk. "This was received here 3 weeks ago. It's a legal copy of my mother's revised will. It names me as beneficiary." The woman paled. I'll get someone." She disappeared. I waited. Counted the breath marks in the marble tile. 13. An older associate came out, face tight. "Ms. McAllister, we're aware of your concerns." "No. You're not. Because this was received. And it was never acknowledged." "Why?" He glanced at the papers. Then at me. "I'll need time to review." "Take the time. But understand, I know what she signed, and I know someone buried it." I left without slamming the door. Didn't need to. The silence was loud enough. Back in the car, I sat with the file in my lap. 3 weeks ago, my mother made a choice. She used her last bit of strength to protect something. Not just the house, not just money. Me? She tried to protect me, and someone, maybe Mark, maybe someone else, decided I didn't deserve to know. I pulled over at the park on the way home. Same one Mom used to like, where she'd feed birds and say nothing for hours. I sat on the bench, watched the wind tug at brittle leaves. Then I took out my phone, played the voicemail again. If Diane's not there, it's not her fault. She stayed. She earned it all. Now I had more than her voice. I had the words she left behind in ink. I had her will. Literally. And figuratively. And no matter what Mark tried to hide, truth doesn't rot in a drawer. It waits. And then it rises. That night, I spread out all the versions of the will on my dining table. Original, revised, suppressed. 3 stories. Only one with a signature that didn't shake. Only one that bore her handwriting in the margins. Only one that told the truth. I matched the ink strokes, compared the pressure. Measured the way she looped her. Oh! When her fingers were still strong, then I pulled out the audio file. Set the laptop on the table beside the documents. Pressed play. Her voice filled the room. Not loud, but clear. It felt like she was sitting across from me again, sweater draped over her shoulders, hair pinned back, lips thin with determination. It felt like she was saying, "I'm still here. And so are you." I thought about calling Mark. I thought about giving him one chance to admit it. To say, "Yes, I intercepted it." To say, "I didn't think you'd fight back." But I didn't. He already said enough when he changed the locks. When he chose speed over truth. And convenience over me. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about precision. Quiet, undeniable precision. I scanned everything. Backed it up. Then I called Ellie from the VA. Told her what I found. Asked if she could help me format a formal submission to the county clerk. She didn't hesitate. "You've got a case, Diane. And more than that, you've got her." That was all I needed. The next morning, I printed one final copy. Held it in my hands. Smoothed the corners. Then I walked to the fireproof safe I had bought 2 years earlier after Mom's first stroke. Unlocked it. Placed the document inside. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because legacies aren't protected by yelling the loudest. They're protected by knowing what to keep. And what to let go. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees. The sky was quiet. Stars barely visible through the clouds. But the wind smelled like honeysuckle. The kind Mom used to plant along the fence. I tried not to think about what it all meant. About how different things could have been if she'd lived just 2 more weeks. If I hadn't gone in for surgery when I did. If Mark hadn't moved so quickly. If someone at the law office had said something. But those are the kinds of thoughts that keep you up for years. And I'd already lost too many nights. What mattered now wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice in the traditional sense. It was correction. A quiet course correction. To honor the woman who whispered in ink. Who trusted me, even when her body betrayed her. And to prove, maybe just to myself, that I wasn't invisible. Not in her eyes. Not in my own. I sat there until the candle burned low. Until the air turned colder. And finally I stood. Not broken, not loud. But ready. Cas I built ein sully nce. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand speech. No slammed doors. No threats tossed across polished oak tables. Just me, a laptop, and the kind of focus I hadn't felt since I wore combat boots. I began with the basics. Dates, signatures, receipts. Created folders with names like valid will, voicemail evidence, and witness statements. Labeled each PDF with timestamps. Cross-checked the USPS confirmation number from Harold with the signature log from the law office. Everything lined up. Clean. Undeniable. It wasn't about catching Mark anymore. It was about making sure the truth had weight. That when I put it down in front of someone who mattered, it didn't budge. I called Ellie again. Told her I wasn't just checking boxes anymore. I was preparing to submit a full rebuttal. She didn't ask questions. Didn't prod. Just said, I know someone. A woman I trust. Veteran. Quiet. Doesn't rattle easy. She'll take this. Her name was Camille Lopez. Estate litigation, 30 years in. The kind of woman who wore soft cardigans and steel eyes. We met at a quiet cafe 2 towns over. I brought everything. Flash drives. Printed folders. Handwritten letters. Even the hospice voicemail, transcribed and time-coded. She didn't speak for a full 10 minutes after reviewing. Then she looked up. You're thorough. And you're not here for revenge. I nodded. Just what's right. She tapped the pen twice on the table. Then let's make sure you get it? The next week blurred. Court clerk filings. Sworn affidavits from Harold Kramer. An email chain from the law firm's paralegal confirming she received the suppressed will but was told not to log it yet. That sentence sat like fire in my inbox. Didn't name Mark directly, but the implication curled around everything like smoke. I printed it. Filed it under it. Negligence, probable interference. Camille guided everything. She was patient, exacting. Asked questions no one else had asked. Like, did your mother ever use voice to text for anything? Do you have any record of her transferring power of attorney? Did hospice ever issue final directives? I spent 3 hours on the phone with Sandy. She remembered it all. Mom's final week. How she clutched my photo. The way she insisted the nurse play the voicemail back to. Test the recorder. How she whispered. If they erase her, she has this. It broke Sandy. She cried on the line. Tried to apologize for not coming forward sooner. I told her she didn't need to. Sometimes, bearing witness is enough. At night, I slept with the file folder next to my bed. Labeled, Truth, do not lose. That wasn't for me. That was for the world, in case they tried again. 3 weeks in, Camille filed a formal petition to the court to challenge the estate division. No drama, no press, just emotion, a voice mine and Mom's, on paper, in sound, in memory. One evening, Camille called late. Said the clerk accepted the packet. Said it was clean tight. Well, supported. Then she paused. If this goes to hearing, you'll need to testify. I didn't blink. I've done harder. Yes, she said. But not for yourself. That landed deeper than I expected. Because she was right. The morning I signed the final affidavit, I wore Mom's bracelet. Silver, simple, engraved inside, EM, quiet strength. She wore it every holiday. Said it reminded her who she wanted to be when everything felt loud. I slid it on slowly. Let it rest against my wrist like armor that didn't shine. After the notarization, Camille asked if I wanted to include a statement. Something the judge can hear from you directly, she said, not legalese. Just your words. I wrote it in the car. Took 20 minutes, no edits, no second drafts. It read, I am not here because I want what's mine. I am here because my mother tried to protect me. And that deserves to be honored. I was with her when no one else was. I heard the pain in her breathing and the steadiness in her hands. She didn't die confused. She died determined, and someone tried to bury that. Camille read it quietly. Folded it. Added it to the folder. It'll matter, she said. I didn't know if she meant in court. Or just to the record. Maybe both. That evening, I visited the hospice. Sandy met me at the side entrance. No uniform, just jeans, cardigan, and tired eyes. She hugged me. No words, just warmth. We walked the hallway, past room 12, Mom's last space. Still smelled faintly of lavender and Lysol. Sandy stopped beside the window seat. She used to sit here. Said it felt like being back in the garden. She didn't cry when she signed that letter. She just said, "Now it's done." I stood there a long time. Let the air settle. Let the ache move, not away, but into place. At home, I found the packet Camille had couriered over. Stamped. Confirmed. It was happening, quietly, but completely. I stood by the kitchen sink. Pressed play one last time. If Diane's not there, it's not her fault. She stayed. She earned it all. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm still here." That night, after the hospice, I couldn't sleep. I turned on the lamp in the dining room and pulled the folder back out. Each document was in its sleeve. Each audio file backed up twice. But something still felt exposed. So I started writing. Not for court. Not for Camille. Just for me. I wrote out a timeline. From Mom's diagnosis to her passing. From Mark's first call to the locks changing. From the voicemails recording to Harold's mailing confirmation. I labeled every moment with a word: presence, silence, erasure, proof. It was like laying bricks across time. A path no one could deny. At 3 a.m., I stepped outside. The garden was damp. The wind carried the last of September's chill. I walked barefoot across the stone path, careful not to disturb the soil she used to tend. And I whispered, "Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it roots." I thought back to Afghanistan. The night I first had to sign something for someone else. A casualty report. I was the highest-ranking medic that shift. The captain had blood out. It was on me. I remember holding the pen. How heavy it felt. How final. That was the first time I learned what signatures meant. How paper could carry truth. Or erase it. Mom knew that too. She'd written hers carefully, even when her fingers curled inward. Even when her voice faded. I wouldn't let that signature disappear. Before dawn, I added one more label to the file. Not for evidence. For legacy. A single word. Kept. Because that's what I was doing now. Keeping her voice. Keeping my place. Keeping the truth intact, quietly. But without apology. As light crept into the sky, I made tea. The last packet of chamomile Mom liked. I sat by the window with her old letter box. The one she kept in the pantry, labeled, "Miss." Inside were birthday cards, scribbled lists, a few receipts so faded I could barely read them. And 2 letters. One to me, one never addressed. I opened mine again. Folded from years ago. Ink smudged near the bottom. If I don't get the chance to say this out loud, I'm proud of you. Not because you served. Not because you stayed, but because you never stopped doing the right thing. Even when no one clapped. I read it twice. Then folded it again, slipped it back into its envelope. No applause, no phone calls, but I felt seen. Fully. By 7 a.m., I filed the last printout, closed the folder, and left it on the table, right next to the candle. Still burned, still quiet, but constant. Like truth. Like her. Like me. The hearing date was set. No media. No family yet notified. But I knew. And that was enough to sleep, for now. If someone tried to erase your name, would you fight quietly, or walk away? The summons went out on a Tuesday. No press, no drama. Just a clean court order printed on county letterhead in hand, delivered to the parties involved. Camille texted me a single word after filing, "Filed." No fanfare. No explanation. I liked that about her. Everything about this case, about my grief, had been so loud inside my head, but the way she moved was quiet. Exact. I followed her lead. 3 copies of every document were printed. One for the clerk, one for the judge, one for the opposition. I checked them each by hand. stapled the affidavits with a metal press like I was sealing a promise. In the margins, I wrote nothing. Let the words stand on their own. Mark didn't call me, didn't email, didn't text. But I could feel the tremor through Camille. "They've retained counsel," she said, sipping from a mug that read, "Trust me, I litigate." She didn't smile, didn't blink. "They'll probably try to settle before the hearing," she added. "Should I be ready for that?" I asked. She tilted her head, then shook it. "You're not here to negotiate what was already yours." I didn't tell anyone in the family. Not even cousins. Not even Mom's old church friends who sent cards when she passed. This wasn't a performance. It wasn't about showing up with witnesses in pearls and rage. It was about the record. Clean. Precise. Real. And the truth I now carried like a kind of quiet armor. The week before the hearing, I took a walk to the library, sat in the genealogy section where Mom used to browse obituaries for names she remembered from childhood. I found the book she loved most, Kentucky Gardens by County. Her notes were still in the margin. Page 2420. Lily Bed's Harlan Street layout still true. She'd drawn a crude map of our yard. 3 circles where the rose bushes went. An X over the patch where squirrels used to dig. I traced her handwriting with my finger. Felt the weight of her still living in the ink. And I knew this wasn't about a property. This was about being believed. Camille prepped me for every angle. Cross-examination. Character questions. Timeline inconsistencies. "You were under anesthesia the day the will was filed," she reminded. "And I have the surgical record to prove it," I said. We went over Harold's affidavit. The hospice record. The audio. She called it airtight. But I knew better than to get comfortable. Some truths bend under pressure. I had to be steel. 2 days before the hearing, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. But the voicemail came through. It was Mark. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, Diane. I mean, I get it. You feel left out. But Mom." She made her choices. I just followed through. "Why drag this into court?" I didn't reply. He hadn't asked what I needed. He just wanted it to stop. That night, I stood at the kitchen sink and watched the windows darken. The garden was still. The soil cold. Everything in place. I whispered, "I'm not dragging anything. I'm putting it back where it belongs." And that was enough. Camille called again. "We're up first on the docket, 9 a.m. sharp. Courtroom 2. "Got it," I said. Then I paused. "Do I need to wear black?" She chuckled. "Wear what makes you feel like yourself." So I chose gray. Soft wool. Mom's silver bracelet. And my VA badge tucked in my wallet. Not to show, but to remember. The courthouse sat like a stone fortress at the edge of downtown. I parked 2 blocks away and walked. Each step counted. Not rushed. Not tentative. When I reached the front steps, Camille was already waiting. She handed me a folder. "Final copy. Just in case." I took it, held it like something sacred. Inside, the hall smelled like fresh wax and cold air. A few other cases were being called. People whispering. Typing. Clearing throats. But I didn't hear any of it. Because down the hall, Mark stood with his lawyer. He looked older than I remembered. His tie was crooked. His hands fidgeted. And for the first time in this entire process, he looked small. He glanced at me. Didn't nod. Didn't smile. Just looked. Then turned away. Camille led us into the courtroom. We took our seats. The clerk called roll. The judge entered. And everything began. The judge was a woman in her late 60s. Gray bob. No nonsense. Her eyes scanned the petition, then the attachments. She spoke with clipped confidence. "This court acknowledges receipt of a revised, will dated March 3rd, bearing a notarized signature and supporting affidavit. Ms. McAllister, Your petition claims this document was withheld from probate. Camille stood. Yes, Your Honor. We have documented delivery of said will to the legal representatives, signed receipt by paralegal Erica Mullins, and additional corroborating evidence indicating deliberate suppression. The judge raised an eyebrow. Deliberate. Camille handed forward the emails. Harold's affidavit. A transcript of the voicemail. We also have medical records confirming my client was under general anesthesia during the submission of the contested will. That detail seemed to settle something in the room. Mark's lawyer leaned in, whispered something. Mark didn't respond. He just looked down. Then the judge turned to me. Ms. McAllister, would you like to speak? I stood, heart steady, voice level. I don't need to explain who my mother was to me, but I do want the court to know. She made her wishes clear. More than once. This revised will was her voice, and I'm just here to make sure it's heard. I sat down. No tears. No drama. Just that. The judge nodded once. She turned to Mark. Mr. McAllister, your response? Mark's lawyer stood instead. Your Honor, we dispute the validity of this revised document. The timing, the lack of formal notification. The judge cut him off. Counselor, do you dispute the signature? He faltered. We cannot. Do you dispute the delivery of said document to your firm? Another pause. We cannot locate confirmation within our internal records, but do you have evidence that the decedent was coerced or mentally unfit at time of signature? Longer pause. No, Your Honor. The courtroom went still. The judge leaned back. She didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds. Then, the evidence submitted is compelling. This court will issue a ruling within 7 business days. In the interim, the estate shall be frozen and all pending disbursements halted. She struck the gavel. Adjourned. Mark didn't look at me when we stood. He gathered his papers quickly. Avoided eye contact, left without a word. Camille touched my elbow gently. You did what needed doing. I nodded. In the hallway, I passed Erica, the paralegal. She looked at me like she wanted to say something. Then she did. I'm sorry. I didn't know he'd pull it. I was told to hold it pending family approval. I didn't know they'd bury it. I believed her. Not because she said it with tears, but because she didn't ask for forgiveness. She just told the truth, and that was enough. I stepped outside. The air had shifted. It was warmer than I expected. Brighter. The sky clear. I didn't smile. But I felt something unstick inside my ribs. Something open. Like maybe this chapter was almost done. Not over, but finally turning. At home, I placed the unopened envelope on the table, next to the candle. Same one I lit when I first played Mom's voicemail. I didn't rush. I made tea. Warmed my hands. Stared out the window. And I remembered. Being 6 years old at the kitchen table, Mom's hand guiding mine, as I wrote my name in shaky letters. If you can write it, she'd said, you can claim it. That memory wrapped around me like a second spine. I didn't need to tear open the court's ruling right away. Because win or not, the truth was already mine. It had always been. They just didn't expect me to hold it this long. So I left the envelope where it sat. Lit the candle again. Let it burn. Not for ceremony, but for all the quiet things that survive when the loud ones collapse. Now, I was ready. WHTHE stowed ONITSOWN. The judgment came in an envelope the color of ash. No gold seal. No weighty signature. Just standard paper, folded once, filed under case Fay 24, CV 1083. Camille was the one who opened it. She read it silently in my kitchen, by the same candle I'd lit the night before. Then she handed it to me. It's done, she said. I unfolded the letter slowly. Black print, no fanfare. Just this. The revised will dated March 3rd is hereby recognized as the valid testamentary document. Full executorship is granted to Diane McAllister. All prior claims nullified. That was it. 3 lines. After everything, that was all it took. And somehow, it was enough. Camille exhaled through her nose. They have no grounds to appeal. The judge's ruling is airtight. I nodded. She didn't ask how I felt. Didn't offer a hug. Didn't say, "Congratulations." And I was grateful for that. Because this wasn't a win. It was a restoration. Of a voice. Of a name. Of a woman who'd been erased in silence, but left enough behind to be found. The fallout came in waves. Mark didn't call. But his wife did, just once. Left a message that started polite and spiraled quickly. "You should have talked to us first. You didn't have to go legal. This is just going to cause more pain." I didn't call back. They were never concerned with pain. Just with quiet. And I wasn't quiet anymore. Not about this. 3 days after the ruling, Erica from the law office sent me a letter. Typed. Signed. To acknowledge the error in internal handling and to formally apologize. It wasn't warm. But it was official. I added it to the file marked, "Record closure." The house went still after that. No calls. No visitors. No press. Just the mail. The soft clink of the wind chimes, and my own footsteps over the kitchen tiles. I walked the property again. Checked on the back garden. The hose still curled under the lilac bush. The bench still creaked when I sat on it. I looked out across the yard and realized I didn't need to restore it. It had kept itself. Waiting. I found one of Mom's old notebooks in the attic. Spiral, bound, yellowed, filled with planting notes and grocery lists. At the back, in faded ink, she'd written, "What I leave behind should never leave her." No context. No name. But I knew. I sat down on the attic floor and cried. Not because I was sad. But because it was the first time I felt chosen. Camille called to confirm the next steps. Transferring accounts. Redditling assets. Issuing notifications to the county. I asked if she could handle most of it. She said yes. Then she paused. "You know, Diane. A lot of people would have gone public with this. You didn't." I smiled into the phone. I didn't need to. That weekend I drove to the edge of town. To the small memorial garden behind St. Luke's Church, where Mom used to volunteer. I brought nothing fancy. Just a small stone. Carved with one word. Kept. I placed it by the bench under the magnolia tree. No plaque. No name. Just that. Because what matters doesn't need to shout. The first real conversation came from Aunt Marlene. She called on a Thursday afternoon. "I read the notice," she said. "Is it true?" I didn't ask what part. I just said, "Yes." There was a long silence. She always said you had her backbone. That made something shift in my chest. "I didn't do it to win," I said. "I know," she replied. "That's why you did." The next letter came from the hospice. Sandy again. This time, not a voicemail, but a hand-written card with a small pressed flower inside. "Thank you for making her voice count. We still play the voicemail when staff feel lost. It reminds us what real presence sounds like." I held the card for a long time. Then placed it beside Mom's letters. I didn't throw a party. Didn't buy anything new. But I did take one small step. I changed the nameplate on the front gate, where it used to say, "The McAllisters." I had it remade. Now it read simply, "Elaine's Garden." Because whatever came next, it started with her. The day the transfer of property finalized, I went to the old safe in the hallway closet. The one I'd avoided since the funeral. Inside were photos, insurance papers, and a sealed envelope labeled, "Diane." I hadn't seen it before. My hands shook when I opened it. Inside was a single page. Typed, no date. If you're reading this, then I did something right. I trusted the right one. I know the world might try to shut your voice down, but you're stronger than silence. And quieter than pride. That's the best kind. Keep what matters. Let go of what doesn't. And when you walk across my land, know that it's yours because you never asked for it. I folded the letter, pressed it to my chest, and whispered, "Thank you." That night, I sat outside under the porch light. The breeze was soft. The stars barely visible. But something in me settled. I hadn't fixed everything. But I'd protected something sacred. And sometimes, that's the only justice we ever get. The following week, Camille and I met one last time. We sat in the back booth of the cafe we'd used since the start. She wore her usual gray cardigan. I brought the final documents in a manila envelope. She didn't need them. Everything had already been filed. But I wanted her to see that nothing had been missed. She glanced through the last pages, then set them aside. "You know," she said, "you handled this like someone used to trudge." I smiled. I figured. "You didn't panic once." I shrugged. "I panicked. I just didn't let it choose for me." She nodded, then slid a final receipt across the table. "This is the last bill. But it's on the house." I blinked. "Camille. Call it a personal clause. Veterans and daughters who don't back down get discounts in my firm." I laughed, softly. The kind of laugh that comes after months of holding your breath. Then I stood, shook her hand, and walked out into a street that finally felt open. That weekend, I went back to the garden. Early, before the sun had fully settled in. I wore Mom's straw hat, her old gloves, the ones with holes in the thumbs. The soil was soft from last night's rain. I dug in small patches, turned the earth slowly, spoke aloud when I found a stubborn root. I wasn't planting anything yet, just making space for something honest to grow. A little girl passed by on the sidewalk with her grandmother. She stopped by the fence. "Is that your garden?" I looked up, wiped the dirt from my hands, thought for a moment, then said, "No." "But you're working in it." "I'm just keeping it," I said. She smiled and waved. I waved back. Later that evening, I brewed tea and sat on the back steps. The candle flickered in the kitchen window behind me. The wind rustled the leaves, and the smell of mint drifted from where Mom had planted it years ago. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since she left, I didn't feel like something was missing. I felt full. Not finished, but full. Before bed, I opened Mom's photo box. I hadn't touched it in months. Inside were snapshots from every stage of her life. Some in black and white, others with yellowed corners. One photo caught me off guard. It was of the two of us in the garden, years ago. I must have been 9. Hair wild, holding a crooked sunflower. She was kneeling beside me, mid-laugh, hand on my shoulder. On the back, in her handwriting, "Let her grow where she stands." I placed it in a new frame, set it on the table by the window. Then I reached for a note card and wrote a single line. She was heard. I didn't sign it. Didn't need to. I slipped it into the final folder, under everything else. Then turned off the light, and let the night hold all of it. THEGARDENDOESNTNETOB Lodi. I didn't change much after the ruling. Didn't repaint the house. Didn't hire landscapers. Didn't host anything with wine glasses or catered cheese. But I did start waking up earlier and walking the perimeter. Each morning I'd touch the gate, the new nameplate still smooth beneath my fingers. Elaine's garden. I never called it mine out loud, but the land didn't ask for ownership, it just asked to be kept. I began journaling again. Not about the trial. Not about Mark, but about what I noticed that the lilacs were blooming earlier this year. that the robins had returned to the same branch, that the soil near the back fence held water just long enough to sprout something wild. It felt like she was still there. Not as a ghost, but as something rooted. Something still speaking, even if no one else was listening. One morning in early spring, the little girl returned. The one who'd asked if it was my garden. This time she had gloves, too big for her, and a notebook with a pink cover. She stood shyly at the gate. "Can I help?" I blinked, then smiled. "Do you know how to dig?" She nodded quickly. "I brought my own trowel. My grandma said it's okay." I let her in. We worked in silence for the first 10 minutes. Just pulling weeds, turning soil. Then she asked, "How do you know where to plant?" I knelt beside her. "Same way you know where to stand." She looked confused. "Where the light falls the longest?" I said. She scribbled that in her notebook, tongue tucked in concentration. I smiled again. She started coming every Saturday. Her name was Riley. 8 years old. Quiet, observant. Not once did she ask about who used to own the house. She only asked about what could grow there now. By June, the garden had shape again. Nothing grand. Just well tended. I added a small bench under the oak tree. Refinished Mom's bird feeder. Hung a sign Riley painted. Things take time. One day, while we were harvesting mint, Riley paused. "Will it always be yours?" The question caught me. I looked at the garden. Then at her. "No," I said softly. "But I hope it'll always be someone's who listens." That night, I wrote a letter. Not for court. Not for anyone specific. Just for the one who might hold this land next. To whoever comes after, this isn't a garden. It's a story. Some of it's visible, like roots that push up and bloom. Some of it's buried, like hurt that never got spoken. But all of it matters. I didn't build this place. I kept it. I didn't fight to win. I stayed to remember. If you ever feel erased, let the earth remind you what survives. It won't cheer. It won't argue. It will hold. So plant carefully, and listen often. You don't need applause to grow something real. I folded the letter. Slipped it inside an envelope. Wrote, "For later," and placed it in the back of the pantry, under Mom's old tin box. Some things don't need to be found quickly. Only at the right time. On Riley's last Saturday before school started again, she brought me a gift. Wrapped in paper towel. Tied with garden twine. "It's not much," she said. "But I wanted to say thanks." Inside was a pressed leaf. Laminated, labeled in her handwriting. "Elaine's mint, strong and quiet." I swallowed a lump in my throat. "Thank you," I said. But what I meant was, you heard her, too. Later that day, I walked to the back fence. Stood where the sun hit hardest. Remembered Mom saying once, "You don't need to be the loudest voice in the room. Just the one that keeps its shape." I whispered it back into the wind, and let the garden take it in. That night I lit the candle one more time. Not for grief. Not for memory. Just as thanks. Thanks for being kept. Thanks for not letting go. Thanks for knowing when to speak, and when to let the earth speak instead. The house was still, but the land was full, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to explain why I stayed. The story had already said enough. That evening, I opened the drawer in the hallway that used to hold Mom's scarves. Inside was the usual, half-used candles, a pair of garden shears, a broken measuring tape, but tucked beneath it all was something I hadn't seen in decades. Her service pin. Polished, oval, still sharp at the clasp. It used to sit on her blazer when she worked at the VA. A symbol of quiet duty. Of not needing recognition to matter. I held it for a long time, then walked to the shelf in the kitchen and placed it beside Riley's mint leaf. One memory beside another. A woman who served without fanfare. And a girl who listened without asking for credit. Legacy doesn't need a ceremony. It just needs one person who remembers what was planted. By late August, the sun hung lower. The garden leaned toward autumn. Riley's notebook sat on the porch. She'd left it behind by accident. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Drawings of roots. Dates next to each bloom. And one sentence repeated in shaky handwriting. Let it grow quiet. Let it grow real. She'd written it at least 4 times. Each in a different color. Each like a vow. That night, I added one more line to the letter I'd tucked away. If someone asks how this place was kept, tell them. By hands that didn't need to be seen. I sealed the envelope again. Placed it back in the tin. And smiled. Because maybe that's the final part of healing. Not needing applause. Just knowing nothing was lost. The next morning, I opened my garden journal, flipped to a fresh page, dated it. Then, for the first time, I wrote a name that wasn't mine. Riley. Helper, learner, listener. First lesson, where the light falls longest. I drew a small mint leaf next to her name. The lines weren't perfect, but they held. Legacy had begun. Not in blood, but in care. Before the sun got too high, I stepped into the yard. Barefoot, hands empty. I knelt near the oak. Pressed my fingers into the soil, felt its cool pull, and breathed, not shallow, not strained, but full. No one clapped, no one watched. But still, I had arrived. If you've been quietly erased but stood back up, share your story below. You're not alone.